If you've ever been told you're being too sensitive, or that you should just be happy with what you've got, then you know how a certain kind of poison works. It doesn't kill you outright. It just seeps into your bones, slowly, over years, until you start to believe it yourself. My family were masters of that particular craft, and for 34 years I was their most dedicated student. It all came to a head on a Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of day where the sky is the color of a washed-out dish rag and the wind smells like dying leaves and distant rain. That was the day my brother Dean sold our soul. He called it selling the farm. To me, it was the same thing. My name is Joyce, and for 5 generations, my family, the Abernathy's, had worked the same 2,000 acres of rolling hills and stubborn clay soil. It wasn't just land, it was a living history book. You could feel it in the deep grooves worn into the stone steps of the farmhouse, in the scent of hay and earth that clung to the old barn, a scent no amount of time could ever truly erase. It was in my blood, but it wasn't in Dean's. To him, the land wasn't a legacy, it was an asset, an underperforming one. He'd left for the city the moment he could, got a business degree, and came back wearing suits that cost more than our monthly grocery bill, and speaking a language of leveraging and liquidity that felt alien on that soil. He saw dying timber, not the woods where our great-great-grandfather had hidden from a winter storm. He saw inefficient pastures, not the fields where I'd learned to ride a pony. He saw a liability. I saw home. But our parents, tired and worn down by years of fighting the weather and the markets, saw a way out. They saw a retirement plan in the slick, glossy brochures of AgriCorp, the corporate agriculture giant Dean brought to our door. They saw the number at the bottom of the contract, a number with so many zeros it looked like a misprint. They didn't see the fine print. They didn't see what we were really giving up. The inciting incident, the moment the poison finally reached a lethal dose, wasn't the signing of the papers, it was the conversation afterwards. We were standing on the porch of the old farmhouse, the place I would have to vacate in 30 days. The air was thick with the awkward silence of a monumental decision. Dean clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to be comforting but felt like a brand. He was smiling, that bright, predatory smile he'd perfected in boardrooms. He said, "Joyce, I know you're upset, but this is for the best. The real money, the smart money, is in investments, not dirt." He'd made sure the deal was ironclad, brokering it himself for a hefty commission and a cushy consulting gig with AgriCorp. I just stared at the tree line, my throat too tight to speak. My entire world had been sold out from under me, and he was talking about it like a stock tip. He must have mistaken my silence for acceptance, or maybe he just didn't care enough to notice the difference. He continued, his voice laced with that condescending warmth he used when he thought he was being generous. "And look, I made sure you got something out of it. I told them the old apiary, and those last few acres of useless wildflower fields by the creek were to be sectioned off for you. Your name's on the deed. It's not much, but you can, you know." He gestured vaguely, searching for the right words. "You can play with your bees. Play with my bees." The words hung in the air between us, small and sharp, and utterly devastating. He saw my life's passion, the one thing that connected me to our great-grandmother, Beatrice Abernathy, as a child's hobby. A little consolation prize, to keep the sentimental sister quiet while the men handled the real business. He didn't know. He couldn't possibly know. He didn't know that great-grandma Beatrice wasn't just a farmer's wife. She was a quiet pioneer in apitherapy, the medicinal use of bee products. He didn't know that her journals, which I had inherited, weren't just collections of recipes, but detailed logs of her experiments, her discoveries. He didn't know that the useless wildflowers on my tiny plot of land weren't useless at all. They were a unique, isolated strain she had cultivated over decades, a resilient blend of local flora that produced a honey so rare, so medically potent, it was practically a myth in certain circles. The bees I was playing with were the direct descendants of her prized colonies. That tiny forgotten corner of the farm wasn't a handout, it was the crown jewel, and he had just handed it to me for free, wrapped in the most insulting sentence I had ever heard. In that moment, watching his self-satisfied smirk, a cold, quiet resolve settled in my chest. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment, it was about survival. But I think, deep down, a little part of me knew. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. He thought he'd left me with a toy. He had no idea he'd just handed me a weapon. The weeks that followed the sale were a blur of hollowed-out grief. I moved out of the farmhouse, the only home I'd ever known, and into a small rented cottage on the edge of town. It was clean and sterile, and smelled of fresh paint and new carpets, a scent that felt like an assault after a lifetime of wood smoke and old books. Every box I unpacked felt like a shovelful of dirt on a grave. The family photos seemed to mock me from their frames, smiling faces from a life that no longer existed. Dean would call, his voice booming with artificial cheerfulness, talking about market trends and his new portfolio. He was living in a high-rise apartment in the city now, a glass box in the sky. He'd talk about the view, about the deals he was closing. He never once asked how I was doing. Not really. My parents were worse, in a way. They'd call and speak in hushed, careful tones, as if I were a fragile thing that might break. They'd talk about their new condo in a retirement community, an hour away, their new friends, their new hobbies. They were so desperate to convince themselves they had done the right thing, so terrified of buyer's remorse, that they couldn't bear to acknowledge my pain. It was an unspoken accusation against their decision. My sadness was inconvenient, so they talked around it, their conversations a minefield of things left unsaid. We never talked about the farm. It was the ghost at every phantom dinner table. I fell into a deep, quiet depression. I'd spend my days staring out the window, or walking aimlessly through the sterile, identical streets of the subdivision. The vibrant, living world of the farm had been replaced by a monochrome landscape of beige siding and manicured lawns. I felt disconnected, untethered, like a plant ripped from the soil. The only place I felt any flicker of my old self was on my little plot of land, the 3 acres of wildflower fields and the old apiary. It was an island of beautiful, chaotic life, in a sea of corporate sterility. AgriCorp's massive GPS-guided tractors were already plowing under the familiar contours of our old fields, leveling hedgerows, tearing down the ancient oaks that stood in their way. From my little sanctuary, I could sometimes hear the distant mechanical groan of progress. It sounded like a monster chewing up my memories. One afternoon, sitting on an overturned log by the creek, I broke down completely. It wasn't loud, dramatic sobbing. It was a silent, gut-wrenching despair that left me breathless. I was alone. My family had traded their history for a comfortable future and left me behind with the scraps. Dean's words echoed in my head. "Play with your bees." It was so dismissive, so belittling. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being the quiet, responsible one, while he was the shining, celebrated one. Flashbacks, unbidden, started to flood my mind. I remembered being 12, and Dean, who was 16, crashing our father's truck into a ditch. I was the one who ran 2 miles back to the house to get help. I was the one who sat with Dad all night in the garage, while he painstakingly hammered out the dent, his knuckles bleeding. But when the story was told at family gatherings, it was about how Dean, with his quick thinking, had managed to avoid a worse accident. He was the hero. I was a footnote. I remembered my college fund. It wasn't a fund so much as a promise. But when Dean's first can't-miss business venture failed, taking $20,000 of borrowed money with it, my college fund vanished to bail him out. My parents sat me down at the kitchen table, the one with the scratch on it from where I'd dropped a bowl as a child. They looked so tired. "It's just temporary, Joyce," my mother had said, her hand fluttering near mine, but never quite touching. "Dean has so much potential. We can't let this ruin him. You understand, don't you? You're the sensible one. I did understand. I understood that my dreams were secondary. I went to a local community college, working 2 jobs to pay for it. Dean was celebrated for his resilience in bouncing back from his setback. I remembered the holidays. For years, I was the one who planned everything. The menus, the shopping, the decorating. I'd cook for days, trying to recreate the magic of my childhood. Dean would breeze in on Christmas Eve, laden with expensive impersonal gifts, and hold court in the living room, accepting praise for his generosity, while I was in the kitchen, sweating over a simmering pot of gravy. One year, our mother's prized porcelain gravy boat, a family heirloom, slipped from my tired hands and shattered on the floor. The silence was deafening. Dean sighed dramatically. "Can't you be more careful, Joyce? Mom loved that thing." No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed the burn on my arm from the splash of hot gravy. They just saw what was broken. They always just saw what I broke, never what I fixed. That was the pattern. I was the bedrock, the foundation, solid, dependable and completely invisible. Dean was the fireworks display, loud and dazzling, and celebrated for simply showing up. He was the golden child. I was the family's caretaker, their scapegoat, their shock absorber. My role was to be sensible, to understand, to sacrifice. And I had played my part perfectly for my entire life, hoping that one day, they would finally see me. The sale of the farm was the final, brutal confirmation that they never would. They hadn't just sold the land. They had sold my last hope of being seen. Sitting there by the creek, the full weight of that history crashed down on me. The grief was so profound, it felt physical, a crushing weight on my chest. I felt a flicker of something ugly. Hate. It was a cold, sharp feeling, and it scared me. I didn't want to be a person who hated her own family. But what was I supposed to do with all this pain? Where was it supposed to go? That evening, I went back to my sterile little cottage and started unpacking one of the last boxes. It was filled with my great-grandmother Beatrice's things. Her worn gardening gloves, a small silver-backed hairbrush, and at the bottom her journals. There were 5 of them. Thick, leather-bound books filled with her elegant looping script. I had read them before, of course, but mostly for the recipes for honey cakes and the charming anecdotes about farm life. I'd never truly studied them. I opened the first one. The ink was faded, the pages brittle, but as I started to read, really read, I saw it wasn't just a diary. It was a scientific log. Beatrice, with no formal education beyond the 8th grade, had been a brilliant self-taught botanist and chemist. She meticulously documented the cross-pollination of the local wildflowers, creating hybrids that were more resilient, more nectar-rich. She drew detailed diagrams of bee anatomy. She recorded the effects of different types of honey on everything from burns and coughs to arthritis and insomnia. This was her life's work, hidden in plain sight. Then I found the entry that changed everything. Dated May 1938. She wrote, "Have finally stabilized the Ethel Rose and the Creek Fire Primrose crossbreed. The bees seem to favor it above all others. The honey they produce this season has a most peculiar quality. It is unusually thick, with a dark amber color, and a faint, almost medicinal scent. Elias Sr. complains it is not sweet enough for his morning toast, but a small poultice of it on his boy's hand, burned by the forge, healed the skin in 2 days with no scar. Remarkable. I shall call this strain Abernathy's balm. It must be protected. The bees and the flowers are a secret trust. Abernathy's balm. Ethel Rose, Creek Fire Primrose. I knew those names. They weren't just random wildflowers. They were the dominant species in my 3-acre field. They were everywhere. I walked those fields my entire life, and just thought they were pretty weeds. My great-grandmother hadn't just let them grow. She had created them. This wasn't just a random patch of land. It was a purpose-built, outdoor laboratory. The catalyst wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was a slow dawning realization, a cold fire that started in my gut and spread through my veins. Dean hadn't left me with a useless field. He had left me with a gold mine. My family hadn't just overlooked me. They had overlooked the most valuable thing we ever had. The grief that had been crushing me began to transform, hardening into something else. It was resolve. It was purpose. I closed the journal and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The sad lost woman, who had been staring back at me for weeks, was gone. In her place was someone I hadn't seen in a very long time. It was Beatrice Abernathy's great-granddaughter, and she was done playing. The first step was to confirm what I suspected. It was one thing to read about a miracle honey in an 80-year-old journal. It was another to prove it in the 21st century. My little rental cottage suddenly became a command center. I spent hours online, falling down research rabbit holes of apitherapy, medicinal honeys, and botanical patents. The world of high-end honey was a revelation. Manuka honey from New Zealand, cedar honey from Yemen. These were selling for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars per jar, for their unique antibacterial properties. But what Beatrice described, the rapid scar-free healing, seemed to be on another level entirely. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an expert, someone with credentials who wouldn't dismiss me as a crackpot. I found him at the State University's Agricultural Science Department, about an hour's drive away, Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a tenured professor in botany and ethnopharmacology, the study of traditional medicines. His profile picture showed a man in his late 50s with a kind, weathered face and a tweed jacket that looked like it had seen its fair share of field work. He seemed approachable. I drafted an email a dozen times, trying to sound professional and not like a desperate woman clinging to a family legend. I attached high-resolution photos of the wildflowers and a scanned page from Beatrice's journal, the one describing Abernathy's balm. I hit send, my heart pounding, fully expecting to be ignored. To my astonishment, he replied within an hour. "Miss Abernathy, your photos are intriguing. The floral structure is unfamiliar. And this journal entry, this is fascinating. Would you be willing to bring me a sample of the honey and the flowers? My lab has the equipment to run a full analysis. No charge. Consider it professional curiosity." That meeting was the beginning of my new life. Dr. Thorne's office was a wonderful cluttered mess of books, plant pressings, and strange-looking scientific instruments. He listened patiently as I told him the whole story, the farm, Dean, the useless fields. He didn't interrupt, he just nodded, his eyes full of intelligent curiosity. When I finished, he took the small jar of dark amber honey I'd brought and held it up to the light. He opened it, and the faint, herbaceous, almost pine-like scent filled the room. He dipped a small glass rod into it and tasted it. His eyebrows shot up. "Remarkable," he murmured. The same word Beatrice had used. "The viscosity, the low sugar profile. This is highly unusual." He promised to have his lab run a full gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis to identify its chemical compounds. He said it would take a few weeks. Those weeks were agonizing. I threw myself into the work, tending to the bees with a new sense of reverence. I was no longer just playing. I was the custodian of a legacy. I read Beatrice's journals from cover to cover, absorbing every detail. She had documented everything: bee lineage, bloom cycles, ideal harvesting times. It was a complete instruction manual. During this time, I also reconnected with Elias, one of our oldest farmhands. His father, Elias Sr., was the man mentioned in Beatrice's journal. The family had lived and worked on our land for 3 generations. After the AgriCorp sale, he was let go with a meager severance package. I found him working at a gas station off the highway. He looked tired and diminished under the harsh fluorescent lights. Seeing him, a man who knew more about our land than anyone, reduced to this, filled me with a fresh wave of shame and anger. This was the human cost of Dean's smart money. I started visiting him, bringing him jars of the regular honey from the hives, and just talking. He told me about the changes. AgriCorp was efficient, he said, but soulless. They'd torn out the windbreaks, and the topsoil was already starting to erode. They were spraying pesticides that made the air smell like chemicals. "The land is sick, Joyce," he'd said, one evening, his voice low. "It's forgetting how to be itself." This subplot, my connection to Elias, became my moral anchor. It reminded me what I was fighting for. It wasn't just about my own vindication, it was about the community, the history that Dean had so casually discarded. I promised him, and myself, that if I ever could, I would make things right. The call from Dr. Thorne came on a Monday morning. His voice was electric. "Joyce, you need to come to the lab. Now, and you might want to bring a lawyer." My stomach clenched with a mixture of terror and excitement. When I arrived, he had printouts and charts spread across a large table. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a kind of scientific glee. "We've never seen anything like this," he said, pointing to a complex-looking graph. "Your great-grandmother wasn't just making honey, she was a bioengineer. The unique combination of nectar from her hybridized wildflowers creates a synergistic effect in the bees' digestive systems. They produce a honey that is packed with a previously undiscovered, highly stable enzyme. He called it abernathine. He explained that in their tests, this enzyme demonstrated incredibly powerful anti-inflammatory and regenerative properties. It promoted cellular repair at a rate that was, and I quote, medically staggering. He held up a petri dish. "See this, it's a culture of human skin cells. We introduced a sterile incision. This half was treated with a leading medical-grade healing gel. This half was treated with a tiny amount of your honey." He pointed to the side with the honey. The incision was nearly gone. The cells had regenerated with almost no scarring. My knees felt weak. I had to sit down. "This isn't just honey, Joyce," he said, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "This is a bioactive medical compound. A single pure ounce of this could be worth, well, the value is astronomical, especially in the high-end cosmetic and dermatological fields. Think scar reduction, anti-aging, post-surgical recovery. But, and this is crucial, it's all tied to that specific enzyme, which is only produced by your bees feeding on your specific wildflowers. They are a closed, proprietary biological system." My hidden leverage wasn't just the honey. It was the entire ecosystem. The flowers, the bees, and the land they lived on. Dr. Thorne helped me find a patent lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright. We spent the next month in a whirlwind of legal activity. We filed patents for the unique DNA of the Athelrose Primrose hybrid, trademarked the name Abernathy's Balm, and created a legal framework that protected the entire process as a trade secret. The small plot of land Dean had given me was now legally a unique and protected biotechnological asset. Throughout this process, Dean's calls became more and more infrequent, then more and more demanding. He had heard through the family grapevine that I was consulting with professors and hiring lawyers. He called me, his voice dripping with suspicion. "What are you up to, Joyce? Don't tell me you're trying to sue us over the sale. You'll lose. The contract is ironclad." I just said, "I'm just tending to my bees, Dean. Just like you told me to." The line went quiet for a moment. I could almost hear him trying to figure out the angle. His world was one of hidden motives and strategic plays. He couldn't comprehend that I was just following a path that had been laid out for me 80 years ago. The irony was crushing. My family had always called me the sensible one, the grounded one, because I loved the dirt, the land. They saw it as a lack of ambition, but they were the ones who couldn't see the value right under their feet. They were looking at spreadsheets, while I was looking at the soil. They thought I was stuck in the past, but I was the only one who had truly inherited our future. As Miss Albright filed the final paperwork, the feeling wasn't triumph, it was a quiet, cold certainty. The game had been set, the pieces were in place, and I was finally ready to make my first move. The first move had to be silent, but significant. It couldn't be a press release or a flashy announcement. That would give Dean and AgriCorp time to react, to strategize. It had to be a quiet transaction that would ripple through the right channels and reach them like an undeniable seismic shock. Dr. Thorne, my invaluable ally, made an introduction. He had a former student who was now a senior materials scout for a highly exclusive, boutique cosmetics firm based in Switzerland. The company Genevieve Lux was renowned for its almost fanatical pursuit of rare natural ingredients for its ultra-high-end anti-aging lines. Their products were sold in tiny jewel-like jars to a clientele that never looked at price tags. We arranged a meeting, not in a boardroom, but on my 3 acres. I wanted them to see the source. The scout, a chic, intelligent woman named Celine, arrived in a black town car that looked completely out of place on the dusty country road. She walked through the wildflower fields with Dr. Thorne and me, her initial corporate skepticism visibly melting away as he explained the unique botany and the story of my great-grandmother. I showed her the hives, the dark, rich honey. I gave her the lab reports and a small, sterile sample of what we were now calling refined Abernathy's balm. She didn't say much, but her eyes, sharp and analytical, missed nothing. She left with a promise to have the sample validated by their own labs in Geneva. A week later, an encrypted email arrived. It was a purchase offer from Genevieve Lux. When I opened the attachment, I felt the air leave my lungs. They weren't just buying a few jars, they wanted to secure the exclusive rights to my entire first year's harvest, a projected 80 kilograms of refined honey. The number they offered was 7 figures. It was more than Dean's entire first-year profit from the sale of our 2,000-acre farm. It was a life-altering, paradigm-shifting amount of money. I signed the contract. The wire transfer hit a new business account Miss Albright had set up for me a few days later. For a moment, I just stared at the balance on the screen. It didn't feel real. The silent takeover was complete. I hadn't fired a shot, but the war was already turning in my favor. Now it was time for the antagonist's panic. I knew it wouldn't take long. The world of high-end commodities and corporate agriculture is smaller than you think. Genevieve Lux, as part of their marketing rollout, filed some preliminary paperwork with European trade commissions, declaring a new exclusive ingredient. It was a standard procedure, but the name Abernathy's balm, sourced from a specific plot of land in my county, was now on a public, albeit obscure, record. It was a Tuesday, almost 6 months to the day since Dean had sold the farm. My phone rang. It was him. His voice was tight, strained. "Joyce. What is this? What is Abernathy's balm?" "I just got a call from a guy I know at the commodities desk at AgriCorp. They track this stuff. He's asking about some miracle honey from our area. He says the Swiss are paying a fortune for it. He said the origin plot is registered too." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "I'm just playing with my bees, Dean. Don't play games with me," he snapped, his voice cracking. "What did you do? Did you find something? Was it there all along? Were you hiding it from us?" The accusations came fast and furious, a torrent of panicked paranoia. He couldn't conceive that I had discovered something. In his mind, I must have known all along. I must have cheated him. "It's from Great-Grandma Beatrice's wildflowers," I said calmly. "The ones on the useless field you gave me. Apparently, they're not so useless." There was a long choked silence on the other end of the phone. I could hear his mind racing, the gears grinding as he tried to process this impossible reality. He, the master of deals, the financial wizard, had made the stupidest trade of his life. He had traded a kingdom for a handful of magic beans, and had given the beans to the one person he was sure would never know how to plant them. The real panic, however, came from AgriCorp. Their business model was based on total control and maximum yield. They had paid a premium for our 2,000 acres, and their geologists and agronomists had surveyed every square inch of it. Or so they thought. They had somehow missed the most valuable asset on the property. a unique biological system that they now had no access to. Sitting on a tiny 3-acre island of land they didn't own, right in the middle of their massive operation. Worse, for them, was the contract Dean had brokered. In his arrogance, to make the deal seem more attractive, Dean had included a clause, a unique asset warranty personally guaranteeing that all significant biological and mineral assets of the land had been disclosed. He had signed it to show his confidence and to secure his lucrative consulting fee. It was standard boilerplate that was rarely invoked. But now, it was a ticking time bomb. AgriCorp realized they had bought a car without the engine, and Dean had personally guaranteed the engine was included. Their first move wasn't against me. It was against him. They sent him a formal letter, which he later read to me over the phone, in a voice shaking with rage and fear. It was a notice of breach of contract. They accused him of fraudulent misrepresentation and material omission. They were threatening to sue him, not just for the return of his commission, but for punitive damages related to the lost opportunity cost of the Abernathy's balm honey. The number they were floating was 8 figures. It would ruin him completely. It would wipe out the money from the sale, his own investments, everything. He would be less than broke. The panic had now officially metastasized. Dean went from arrogant to accusatory, to finally pleading. "Joyce, you have to help me," he begged. "You have to sell the land back to me. Or cut me in. We're family. This is a family asset." "A family asset," I said, my voice as cold and calm as a frozen lake. "It's funny, I don't remember it being a family asset when you called it a useless field and told me to go play with my bees. This is my company, Dean. My discovery. My land. You made sure of that. Your name isn't on the deed." The power shift was palpable. It was a physical thing I could feel through the phone line. The balance that had been tilted against me my entire life had not just leveled out, it had swung violently in the other direction. For 34 years, he had held all the cards. Now, I had the whole deck. The fallout spread from Dean to the rest of the family, like a virus. My parents called next. Their tone was no longer hushed and careful. It was frantic. My mother was the one who spoke. My father a silent, anxious presence. I could hear breathing in the background. "Joyce, darling," she began, her voice thick with false sweetness. "Dean told us about your little honey business. How wonderful. We are so proud of you. We always knew you had it in you." The whiplash was stunning. A lifetime of being the sensible, unambitious daughter, and now I was a prodigy they'd believed in all along. The charade was so transparent, it was insulting. "Dean is in a bit of trouble," she continued, getting to the point. "AgriCorp is being terribly unfair. He made an honest mistake. We were thinking, since this honey comes from Abernathy land, it's really a family legacy. Perhaps you could share some of your good fortune to help your brother. It's the right thing to do. It's for the good of the family." That phrase again. The one they always used to justify my sacrifices, for the good of the family. But we weren't a family. We were a company, and I had always been its most exploited, unpaid employee. Now the company was going bankrupt, and they were trying to raid the pension of the one employee who'd escaped. The calls became a daily occurrence. They started with guilt-tripping. "Don't you love your brother? How can you watch him suffer?" Then they moved to threats. "We'll tell everyone what a selfish, greedy person you are. You'll be an outcast." When that didn't work, they resorted to desperate, pathetic pleading. My mother would weep into the phone, talking about how they might lose their new condo, how their retirement was tied up in the money Dean had invested for them. The most telling part was that in all those calls, not once did anyone apologize. Not once did they say, "We're sorry for how we treated you. We're sorry for not valuing you. We're sorry for taking you for granted." Their only regret was that their lifelong mistreatment of me now had consequences for them. They didn't see me as a person they had wronged. They saw me as a resource they had lost control of. Dean's counter-manipulation was the most desperate of all. He tried to turn my own ally against me, calling Dr. Thorne and accusing him of predatory academic practices and trying to steal family intellectual property. Dr. Thorne, bless his tweed-covered heart, calmly informed Dean that all of his work was done pro bono, out of academic interest, and that all intellectual property was legally and ironcladly in my name, thanks to the deed Dean himself had so thoughtfully arranged. Then came the family exodus. It wasn't a stampede, but a slow, pathetic trickle of relatives who had always sided with Dean and my parents, suddenly remembering my phone number. Aunts, uncles, cousins. They called with flimsy excuses, asking about my health, pretending to have been thinking about me. They were testing the waters, trying to see which way the wind was blowing. They were rats deserting a sinking ship, trying to swim to my island. I was polite, but distant. I didn't offer them a lifeline. I just let them tread water. The final, most pathetic attempt came from Dean. He drove out to my cottage unannounced. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He tried to play his last card, nostalgia. He talked about our childhood, about summers on the farm, about how we used to be a team. He was trying to invoke a shared history that he had systematically dismantled and sold for parts. He was trying to cash a check from an emotional bank account that he himself had emptied long ago. It was a hollow, desperate performance, and for the first time I didn't feel anger or hurt. I just felt a profound sense of pity for him. He had built his entire world on a foundation of smart money, and now that it was crumbling, he had nothing else to stand on. He had no real relationships, no real legacy. All he had was a balance sheet that was about to go deep into the red, and he had no one to blame but himself. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not the screaming match I might have once fantasized about. It was quiet, almost surgical. Dean had exhausted all his other options. The lawyers from AgriCorp were preparing to file their lawsuit. His creditors were calling. He was cornered. He requested a formal meeting. He wanted to bring our parents. He thought they could act as emotional leverage. He was wrong. We met at my cottage. I chose the location deliberately. It was my territory. I had asked Dr. Thorne and Miss Albright to be there as well, not as aggressors, but as silent witnesses to the facts. I also invited Elias. He sat quietly in the corner, a physical reminder of the real-world consequences of their decisions. My parents and Dean arrived, looking like a funeral procession. They sat stiffly on the sofa, a stark contrast to the comfortable, lived-in feel of my home. Dean, trying to reclaim some semblance of control, started to speak. He had a folder of papers with him, a pathetic attempt to mimic the boardroom settings, where he felt powerful. "Joyce, we need to be reasonable about this," he began, his voice trying for a commanding tone, but failing. A clear mistake was made. The value of this substance was not known at the time of the sale. Legally, under the doctrine of mutual mistake, the original contract could be seen as voidable. He was throwing out legal terms he'd probably learned from a frantic Google search. Miss Albright, without even looking up from her notepad, spoke in a calm, clear voice. "The doctrine of mutual mistake, Mr. Abernathy, requires the mistake to be shared by both parties. My client was not mistaken about the value of her land. She was simply unaware of the full extent of its potential, which she then diligently researched. You, on the other hand, were not mistaken. You were dismissive. You declared the land, and everything on it, useless. That is not a mistake of fact. It is a failure of due diligence. There is no legal standing." Dean's face went pale. He turned to me. "Joyce, this isn't about lawyers. This is about family, about what's fair." I leaned forward. "Let's talk about what's fair. Dean, is it fair that you crashed Dad's truck, and I got the blame for being in the way? Is it fair that my college fund paid for your failed business? Is it fair that for 20 years, I did all the work for every family holiday, only to be criticized when a single dish broke? My mother gasped. Joyce, this is not the time to bring up old history. This is the only time, I said, my voice steady, because this isn't about honey. It never was. It's about a lifetime of being treated as secondary, as the sensible, quiet, invisible support system for the rest of you. I looked directly at Dean. You stood on our porch, and you told me to go play with my bees. You said it with a smirk. You thought you were being generous, giving me a little sandbox to play in, while you went off to make the real money. You didn't see land. You saw dirt. You didn't see a legacy. You saw a liability. You didn't see me. You never have. He started to stammer, to protest, but I held up a hand. And now you're in trouble, because of a contract you wrote, a clause you added to make yourself look good. You are facing the consequences of your own arrogance, and you come here, to my home, and you dare to talk to me about what is fair. The new reality settled into the room, thick and undeniable. I was not the victim here. I was not the one who needed saving. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my fields of wildflowers, shimmering in the afternoon sun. Here is the new reality, I said, turning back to them. The company I have built, Abernathy Apiaries, is a success. I have a binding multi-year contract with Genevieve Lux. Next month, I am breaking ground on a new state-of-the-art processing facility and research lab, right here on this land. I have rehired Elias as my new head of cultivation, at a salary that honors his family's generations of service to this land. We are also establishing the Beatrice Abernathy Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture, to help small family farms transition to more ecologically sound practices. I paused, letting it all sink in. I am not going to help you with AgriCorp. Dean, your problem is not my responsibility. This is the consequence of your choices. You wanted to play with the real money. Well, sometimes the real money plays back. My father, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke, his voice raspy. So that's it? You're just going to cut us off? Your own family. I looked at him, at the three of them, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a kind of sad, distant peace. It wasn't about cutting them off. It was about me finally refusing to be the branch they were all sawing off. I am not cutting you off, I said softly. You were the ones who sold the tree. I just managed to save a seed. You are welcome to call me, to visit. But the Bank of Joyce is closed. The emotional and financial support you have taken for granted your entire lives is no longer available. This is my life now. You have to go and build your own. There was nothing left to say. They left in silence. The air in the cottage felt lighter, cleaner, the moment the door closed behind them. I had not yelled. I had not cried. I had simply told the truth. My vindication wasn't in their ruin. It was in my own quiet, unshakable peace. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. My restoration. It's been a year since that day. The new lab is almost finished. A beautiful, low-impact building, nestled among the trees. Abernathy's balm is now a whisper in the most exclusive circles, a miracle ingredient that has the cosmetic world buzzing. I managed to use a portion of the profits, funneled through an anonymous trust, managed by Miss Albright, to buy back a 200-acre parcel of our old farm from a struggling AgriCorp, who found, just as Elias predicted, that their industrial methods were yielding diminishing returns from the tired soil. I am rewilding it, planting native trees, and letting the land heal. It's a start. Dean ended up declaring bankruptcy. AgriCorp's lawsuit, combined with his own bad investments, wiped him out. The last I heard, he was working a mid-level management job for some logistics company, living in a small apartment in a suburb he used to mock. Our parents had to sell their condo and move into a much smaller, less glamorous rental. They call sometimes. The conversations are stilted, awkward. They're still hoping that one day I'll change my mind, that the daughter they knew will come back. But she's gone. She left the day the farm was sold. I spend most of my days out in the fields, or in the apiary. The sound of the bees is no longer just a background hum. It's the sound of my life, my work, my legacy. It's the sound of peace. Elias is happier than I've seen him in years, his hands back in the soil where they belong. We're not just growing wildflowers. We're rebuilding a small piece of the world that my family was so quick to throw away. And this is what I want to leave you with. Your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's not defined by your role in someone else's story, especially if that role is to be the convenient, easy-to-ignore foundation for their own ambitions. Value isn't always on a balance sheet or in a bank account. Sometimes it's in the useless things, the quiet passions, the forgotten knowledge, the legacy that's written in the soil, and not on a deed. They told me I could play with my bees, and they were right. I did play. I played a whole new game, with my own rules, and I won. It turns out my great-grandmother was right. The bees and the flowers were a secret trust, and I'm so grateful I was finally quiet enough to hear them. So I have to ask, what's the useless field in your life that someone has told you to ignore? What quiet passion have you been told is just a hobby? Maybe it's time to take a closer look. You never know what might be growing there. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued by your family, I hope this gives you a little bit of strength. Let me know your own stories in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories about finding your own power. It really does help more than you know.